Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer and occasional guest host. We have an all star lineup to celebrate the New York Times Sports Desk this week. Lawrie Mifflin, George Vecsey, and Bill Roden are here. We're hoping Claire Smith might join us as well. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. And as I mentioned earlier, it's an incredible show planned today. We have some of the great writers that have graced the New York Times sports pages here to join us in celebration of New York Times sports. Please like, please comment, please share, please retweet, tell your friends, tag your friends in in the comments. We'll be able to show your comments on the screen. We're going to have a robust discussion. We're going to do this a little bit differently than we have in previous shows. We're going to start off with a bit of a panel discussion. We'll bring our guests on one by one and introduce them properly. Sri will then review the front page of each of the sections of today's paper about halfway through, kind of like an intermission. And then we'll go back to our panel discussion and maybe focus on the sports section in a little bit. But please go ahead. Let us know where you're watching from. Put your comments in Facebook, in LinkedIn, in YouTube, so we can show them on the screen, and we will go ahead and welcome folks that are joining us. We have Doug Levy watching from Northern California, saying it's an important show today. Doug, thank you always for joining us. 5:30 a.m. Pacific time. Doug is a radio guy, longtime radio guy. Last week I called him an old radio. I got old radio guy, and I got chided for it. He's a longtime radio guy, so he's always up early. But thank you. It means a lot that you spend your early morning hours with us, watching the show. My mom is watching from Hastings on Hudson, New York. Thank you, Mom, as always. Our biggest fan, always there. Naomi says, I'm representing the Pinstripes today. Well played. Yes, it's a balmy Upper West Side this morning and sounds like an interesting lineup. It is an interesting lineup. It's a murderer's row, if you will, if you continue with the Yankees theme. Again, please let us know where you're watching from, and we'll put your comments on the air so everyone can see them. I'm going to go ahead and bring on our host, Sri Srinivasan. Sri, what an incredible show today. I am just excited about what we're doing. Thank you so much for building this community, for building this entire endeavor. I want to go do a quick shout out to our friend Carla Baranakis, longtime booker for the show. We would not have these guests today if it wasn't for Carla. So I want to give a quick shout out to her.
Yeah, thanks, Neil, and thank you, Carla, for everything you've done with us. Carla, longtime national copy chief of the New York Times, and we are celebrating the New York Times Sports Desk. As we say farewell to the Sports Desk, there was a big tremor earthquake through the sports reporting world and sports reading and consumption world when the news was announced that the New York Times is going to basically move all its coverage to The Athletic, a startup that it had bought for lots and lots of money a couple of years ago, and therefore they're not going to use the existing sports desk. They have said that they are going to move. There are no layoffs, and they're moving and offering off jobs to the existing staffers to into other parts of the paper. But today we want to talk about the sports desk, its history, what it's done for sports, what are some of the things that it has covered, some of the landmark stories, as well as the impact it has had on American journalism and American sports journalism. And you use the term murderer's row. We have an international show, so some people
Yes.
may not be familiar with that term. That's the term that was used for the 27 Yankees that were the greatest team perhaps of all time. Some of the most famous players all played in that team. So in American jargon and in American culture, we'll say something is a murderer's row as a very positive piece of a way to describe something, any group of people. So another
Absolutely.
sports analogy that won't make sense to anyone who doesn't watch ESPN. I also like to say this is like the hot tub at Wilbon's house. This is a reference to Mike Wilbon of the great TV show Pardon the Interruption on ESPN, and his partner Tony Kornheiser says whenever there's a group of people, he'll say that's like the hot tub at Wilbon's house. So we have a great lineup. You're going to meet some incredible people. What is this show? Every Sunday we read the Sunday New York Times out loud like crazy people. We've been doing it for 8 years. Some of the guests that you're going to meet have already been on the show, and there's so much to talk about with just the regular week, but this week it's a celebration and a farewell to the New York Times sports desk. We will get a chance to look at the paper. I will just quickly show you the lead stories. DeSantis's flip on vaccine had steep cost for Florida. As his position began to shift, so did his state's death rate for the worse. And you know that the party line is how great Florida did during the pandemic. And here's oil industry, Venezuela's failing lifeline turns more lethal. And that's an example of the photography in the Times. So we'll talk about sports. We'll talk about so much more. And Neil's going to bring on our guests one by one. Please tag and share your friends, anyone who cares about sports, anyone who cares about journalism, media, fighting disinformation. They should be watching. We do this every Sunday, 8:30 to 10 a.m. Eastern time. And as soon as we're off the air, this will air again immediately on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and on digimentors.group. Digimentors is the organization, the company that I co-founded, and Neil is our VP of events and comms. And we do shows like this, we do consulting, we do newsletters, we do training around AI and understanding social media. So check out what we do at digimentors.group. And now we're ready to bring on our amazing set of guests. So Neil, to
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you, Sri. What I want to do is just welcome a few folks who are watching. Diane Stefani is watching from Margate. Ken Fisher watching from Iowa. Pradnya Haldapur from Silver Spring. Likes my shirt. Marilyn Zafert. Charlotte Durant. Patricia Freudenberg watching on LinkedIn. Jonathan watching from the East Village. Rose watching from Massachusetts. And we have Altair Jose Silva watching from Brazil. So a great group of folks watching. And I do want to take the moment before I bring our guests in. Folks know that I ended last week's show early to go to church. At my church, my Unitarian church, not only did we sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," but our minister read from a John Updike essay about baseball, a piece by A. Bartlett Giamatti, former commissioner of baseball, and he actually performed Casey at the Bat during the service. I wore my jersey to church last week. I'm wearing my jersey again to a different church that I go to every Sunday morning. So thank you, everyone, for indulging me and for this incredible show that we have planned. As I mentioned earlier, our all-star lineup, we have Lawrie Mifflin, Claire Smith, George Vecsey, and Bill Roden, who will be joining us. I'm going to introduce them all one by one so that we can give them their due. First up, Lawrie Mifflin. Lawrie, thank you so much for joining us. Lawrie Mifflin had a 30-year career at the Times, working as a sports writer and deputy sports editor earlier in her career. She is now the executive editor of the Hechinger Report. And at the time, she also served as a national desk editor, a business reporter, executive director of television programming, and co-creator of the paper's first web video department. In her role with the Television Enterprise Department, she supervised the production of documentaries based on Times reporting and oversaw all content for the Discovery Times Channel digital cable network, a joint venture of the Times and Discovery Communications. Lawrie, thank you so much for joining us. Longtime viewers might recall that Lawrie joined us for a special show, a tribute to Robin Herman. She and Melissa Lutke joined us for that show, and Carla Baranakis hosted that discussion. So, Lawrie, thank you for coming back.
You're welcome.
Next up, I want to bring on George Vecsey. George Vecsey wrote the Sports of the Times column for the New York Times from 1982 through the end of 2011, if I have my dates right. I might need to fact check that. In 1968, George was hired by the Times, first covering sports, but in 70, he was recruited to become a national correspondent in Appalachia for the Times, based in Louisville. Upon returning to New York, he was a Metro reporter from 73 to 76, and then for the next 4 decades, he covered religion, including Pope John Paul II's first trips to Mexico and the United States, and the Dalai Lama's trip to the United States, returning to the sports desk in 1980. George was a guest on our show as well previously, and I do want to check myself, George. When were you the Sports of the Times columnist? What year?
1982.
Until
end of 2011.
2011.
So I did a few after that. They kept bringing me back for encores.
They kept bringing you back. So I had my dates right. I wanted to make sure of that. Next up, we have Claire Smith. Claire, so great to see you, my friend. And I'm still tickled that you're on our show. I had the chance to interview Claire 3 years ago, and it was an incredible honor. Claire was the first national baseball columnist at the New York Times, writing for them from 1990 to 1998. She is the founding executive editor of the Claire Smith Center for Sports Media at Temple's Lou Klein College of Media and Communication, the first woman inducted into the baseball's Hall of Fame's Writers Wing when she was elected the 2017 winner of the J.G. Taylor Spink Award by the Baseball Writers Association of America. She was the first female to cover a Major League Baseball beat full-time, covering the Yankees, my Yankees, for the Hartford Courant from 1985 to 1990. Claire, that picture of you at the induction ceremony is still seared in my memory. Such an honor to have you join us. Thank you so much, Claire.
It's my pleasure and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, batting cleanup, if you will, Bill Rhoden, William C. Rhoden. Bill joined the Times in 1982 as an editor in the Week in Review section. A year later, he joined the sports department, reporting on high school and college sports. He was the Sports of the Times columnist for 26 years, from 1990 to 2016. He then joined ESPN's Undefeated. And Bill, they've rebranded from the Undefeated. They're called, is it?
It's Anscape. It's Anscape now.
Anscape. Yeah. Anscape now. Bill and George and Claire in particular. Lawrie has so many stories of her work as a pioneer, as a woman covering sports. But for me, growing up in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, getting my little blue bag every day, George, William, and Bill and Claire, I read your bylines growing up, and it is just an incredible honor to have you join us. And so thank you for taking the time today. Sri, I'm going to bring you on and hand it over to you to manage this conversation with these all-time greats. We have who do we have watching in addition to have joined us so far? Deborah Bernick is joining us from DC. Mendel Horowitz is joining from Jerusalem, Israel. George is nodding your head. George, Mendel is a friend of George's from New York State.
Mendel is a friend. His dad, Aaron, is in New York, a Mets fan. And I saw my friend Altanir before from Brazil, who taught me to love Tom Jobim even more.
That was your friend Altanir. That's wonderful.
Got my people.
Apollo is joining us from Philadelphia. Patricia says, congratulations to Lawrie on all your great achievements, calling that out. And we have a classmate of yours, Lawrie, Deborah Bernick, said Lawrie founded the women's field hockey team at Yale in our first class of women, 1969, and a Yale Daily News star. Debbie is a longtime friend of our show, longtime viewer. So she mentioned that she was your classmate, and we were thrilled to see that. Linda Lawrence is watching from Long Island. George, Janet Vecsey O'Rourke, who's this?
Oh, it's my kid sister.
Your kid's sister is watching. It's a family affair. Mary Curtis, Mary C. Curtis is joining us. What a treat. A virtual reunion with so many future former colleagues tuning in from Charlotte, North Carolina. Mary is a former guest on our show and a friend and a frequent viewer. So with that, here is Sri Srinivasan. Sri,
Hello, everyone.
I don't know if I could have set it up any better for you.
No, you couldn't have. This is really important conversation, and what a great group of guests. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Neil, we'll see you in a few minutes.
Absolutely.
I'm going to just get started and talk to each of our guests about the New York Times Sports Desk. Tell us, if you will, all the, what you're feeling, what you're thinking about, and then we'll talk a little bit about your own work there. So I'd love to hear kind of your favorite moments working at the Times Sports Desk. George, we'll start with you.
Well, I could talk about all the things that I wrote, the different things I covered, and the Times allows you, as Lawrie and Claire will attest, you can, and Bill will attest, you can have different careers while you're there. My one lasting feeling about the Times is it was not only the sports section that you all saw, but it was the sports section that we belonged to. And you would go in the office and you would get ideas from people like Elena Justines and Wayne and Jay Schreiber. And then you'd get your backup from people, the unsung heroes of sports, like Fern Turkowitz, the office manager, and then Terry Ann Glynn, who was our backup for more than a decade. And it was feeling of a real team, not just the editors, not just the writers, but the backup. And sometimes if you were wrong, you'd hear from your friends also. So to think that they're folding the big tent, that's the part that I miss. Not so much what was being done, because people will still know about sports.
Okay, thank you, George, and we'll of course hear from you on a lot more about the Sports Desk. Claire, let's go to you. Your thoughts this morning.
Well, my thoughts turn not only to all my friends on the panel and the folks that made my career possible thanks to the knowledge and education that I gleaned from the Times. My thoughts turn to my friend Murray Chass, who was my mentor, if you will, and then a competitor, and finally a teammate who was cherished by me to the nth degree. Murray knew how to report, he knew how to represent the Times, and he knew how to make sure that he, as the lead investigative reporter on all things baseball, was never, ever defeated. He should be in a Guinness Book of Records as being the best in his field. And I think of my years there, 8 years, working alongside Murray, George, Bill, Lawrie, as the most beneficial in my career.
Wow, that's an incredible thought. We will come back to you, Claire, as we talk about the Times. Let's go to Bill Roden. Thank you for joining us, Bill.
Yeah. First of all, I've got to say, man, just looking at the people on this panel, my favorite people in the business. I think of Claire and Lawrie and George. This has made my week. It really has. This is just, it's beyond words. And I know we'll talk about this later, but I guess, you hear athletes talk about this a lot when they leave something, that what they cherish are the people. And I just have so many fond memories of working with Claire and sort of the care she took me when I first started going to the press box in baseball, and how she was revered. And she was just showing me the ropes, and she's still showing people the ropes. Lawrie, led me into the love of soccer, introduced me to it, and hockey of all things, and then when she was on the desk, just a lovely person, smart, wise, great discussing ideas with her. And of course, George, man, is just somebody who I just loved. And the idea of, we'll talk about this later, but sort of the joy of my career probably was being made a Sports of the Times columnist by our friend Neil Amder, and we'll talk about Neil and the great Joe Vecchione later. But it's just a tradition, following Arthur Daly, who I never met, but Red Smith, but working with George and Dave Anderson and Ira, and then Harvey Arrington. It was just such a great tradition, and in fact, I just had lunch in Seattle with the great Kurt Streeter, who followed me as a Sports of the Times columnist. So, there's just so much to talk about. But I just want to thank you, Sri, and Neil for bringing us together, because I'm still trying to get my mind around stuff that's happened to the department. So this is a great way to kind of commiserate in a way and try to deal with this. But no, this is great seeing everybody, and just a wonderful way to begin Sunday morning.
Thank you. We started this, Bill, 8 years ago because we love print newspapers and we love journalism, and we wanted a way to keep talking about it. One of the things we had been told is that newspapers are going to go away. All newspapers, print newspapers, are going to go away. The Times has managed to stay alive and thrive in many ways, whereas lots of other papers have, of course, sadly stopped printing or gone away completely. So this is a celebration not just of the New York Times, but journalism. And one of the things that we've always said is that sports journalism is journalism, and covers all the different aspects of humanity, the greed, the success, the heights, the lows, everything. And that's why whenever there's any kind of disruption like this, it's so hard to take and understand. So we will talk about that as well. Lawrie, let's go to you. Your thoughts. I think you're muted. 1 second. We'll just...
Sorry, I do this all the time on my work Zoom calls too. I apologize. I was muted so that I wouldn't disturb any of you. But Bill mentioned one of the sports editors. I'm sort of the representative on this panel of the other side of the fence. One of my favorite reporters used to say there's the gatekeepers and there's the poachers. And the poachers are the guys trying to get good stuff into the paper, and the gatekeepers are the editors. So I will represent them. But I just want to point out, Sri, 3 of the 4 people on this call were hired by the great Joe Vecchione, whom Bill Roden mentioned. And George was hired by, we talk about me being one of the first women sports writers, Claire being one of the first women sports writers, but the first woman sports editor at the New York Times was Leanne Schreiber, and George was hired by her. So there's a legacy behind the desk as well as out in the field. And I feel really lucky that I have been on both sides, the poacher and the gatekeeper. But and then I also think we'll get around to this, but the legacy of the sports department is also, you mentioned, Sri, that sports journalists are journalists too, and the great Murray Chass, whom Claire mentioned as one of the greatest baseball writers of all time, was also the lead writer on the San Francisco earthquake in, I think it was 1989. But that earthquake happened when Murray and some of the other sports writers happened to be in San Francisco, and they just covered the heck out of it like any other reporter would. So those are some of the legacies, are the fact that we always did honor Times journalism as being the highest caliber journalism we could achieve. And we had the great columnists of the Sports of the Times in a long line legacy. That's what I'm saddest about seeing the department go, is that legacy of great writers that, the other 3 people on this call represent.
Thank you, Lawrie. If you can just set the scene for folks who are watching who may not be familiar with the evolution of the sports section. I remember when it was its own section, of course, and then it was inside Metro, all of that. Now it's inside the front page, the front section of the Times. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you understand is going to be the future of sports in the Times? I'll ask everyone else, but you can share your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm just laughing, Sri, because most of us remember when the sports section wasn't a separate section. It was inside the back of the paper until 1978. There was no sports section in the Times until 1978, and that so as a separate pull-out section. And that was when they created Sports Monday. Joe Vecchione was the first editor of Sports Monday. It became a separate section. And then there was another reboot. I don't know if maybe George and Bill remember. I think, Claire, you might have not been there yet, but where they did all these ads and they took us to Yankee Stadium and they filmed commercials and they put a lot more money into the sports section. And that was probably in the late 80s. Maybe?
Neil was a sports editor at that point.
Yeah.
So it was just after 1990 then.
Right.
Anyway, so then there was Sports Monday. There was a separate sports section every day, and then it kind of devolved downward from there. But I don't really know what the future is with adding the Athletic and using the Athletic instead of the Times Sports Department. I read somewhere that there would be one page in the print newspaper of sports written by Times people, not Athletic people, but I don't have any knowledge of that. I don't know, Bill or Claire or George, if any of you do. I really don't know what the plans are.
I don't know, and not sure anybody knows. It just sounds
Right.
all over the place to me. I do know this, that as Hubie Brown once said about his assistant coaches, we don't hire no idiots here, and Times don't hire no idiots. And all the people that we sent out on sports stories were actually, imagine, journalists. I remember when in the earthquake in '89, when Murray, but also Ira and anybody who was there, Mike Martinez, were out in the city. Murray wrote about a bridge collapsing, and then he went on to there to work. And Joe D'Urso was working at the, quote, bureau out there. So we had a lot of people, and we got back, and the reaction from the people who ran the paper was, can you imagine that they can actually cover a story? And then in the Athens Olympics in 2004, Juliet McClure, who's now in the World Cup, she went out to cover a demonstration, got hit with tear gas, and Brad Smith, our photo editor, got hit by a rock. They thought he had really serious damage. And we got back to New York, and again, the attitude of the editors was they can actually report. Imagine that Juliet could take and file a story with tear gas. So there's a lot of condescension that went on. Now we'll see all the people that we know, all the bylines we know, Branch and Jury, Ken Belson, all of them will do fine as reporters. They're great reporters. The question is whether their new editors will care at all, or whether they'll just be seen as, from the toy department. Again, it could be more condescension.
Toy department is something that people say in other news organizations.
And we had serious people.
Yes, you did. Let's bring in a comment here from Wayne Camadoy, who is a longtime New York Times staffer and designer. And
Hi, Wayne.
Wayne.
and Wayne says, the legacy, tradition, and talent of this amazing panel is reflective of the New York Times Sports Department, which always felt like a big family. Honored to be part of the family for 20 years. Wayne is just one voice. Thousands and thousands of people have commented about what has happened and what's going on. So I'd like to hear a little bit from George about the connection between the writing, the photography, the layout, the design. Why was all that important in telling the stories of sports?
Well, it's interesting. I had a conversation once with Arthur Sulzberger Jr. about why they were going to color. I asked him, why is the Times going to color? And he just looked at me nicely and said, well, you live in color, you dream in color. And they knew what they were doing all along. I mean, the people that run the paper are not fools, and they have done the right things in making it more visible. So you'd work with someone like Barton Silverman when his camera suddenly went digital. I remember how excited he was. Barton is one of our superstars as a photographer, and he was able to pick his own photos and send them back to the office rather than have somebody develop them in the office and maybe pick the wrong one. Barton was so happy he was having more control over his work. And you thought with the photographers, you have these great people go along. And I got used to that as a news reporter, in Kentucky, West Virginia, going along with great photographers. But we had them at the ballpark, and you want to make sure if you were doing something, you'd let them know, Barton and anybody else, Paul Burnett, all those people. You'd say, this is what I'm working on. I'm doing a column on so-and-so. If you could get a picture of him or her, and they would. But you realized you were part of a bigger project.
Yeah,
including Wayne, the layouts, and Elena, the things that they would do to make this a better show. Wayne is one of the people in the office who had ideas, knew about sports, and the main thing is why I call it a clubhouse is that the editors would listen to people, those people.
Our friend Jonathan Borstein watching says, I like the toy department. And even though he likes the idea of course, what the sports department does. And so, Claire, can you talk about how you decided that the sports desk was a good place for you and the opportunity that it gave you?
Well, everyone in the business knows that the Times is Mount Olympus, and you dream of ending up there. I teach students at Temple now. They want to go to the New York Times, and it's like the old saying, how do you get to Broadway? Practice, practice, practice. It takes forever, and you might not make it, but it makes you better whether you work for the Times or not. When there were labor disputes in baseball, and all the reporters from around the country would gather in New York City and stay in the opposition hotel, if you will, the union hotel, while management was in a non-union hotel, and just sit there for hours and hours and hours. But the one time the reporters would vacate the premises every single night was when the Times hit the curb, because they wanted to see what Murray had, what Dave was opining on, George, Ira. It was just must-see TV, to borrow another phrase. And that was pretty cool to see that one paper could have sway over an entire industry. It was humbling to work there, and the responsibility you bore because your name had the New York Times underneath on your byline. It was really, really something to be proud of.
I can totally understand that and appreciate what that meant. Bill, talk about your early days at the Times and maybe your favorite memory.
Yeah, I've got a lot. And again, like I said, I'm still trying to put all this together. I mean, it's like you go back to your old neighborhood, where you grew up, and all of a sudden there's a sawmill where your house used to be, and not calling it like a sawmill. I mean, we all know people who work there, and they have some great people. But I guess, and I kind of reached out to George about this, and I'm saying, George, what does this mean? I mean, I spent 34 years there. And like you said, wrote the Sports of the Times column for, 26, 27 years. And I just love the idea of being there. I love the idea of being in that tradition of Sports of the Times columnists. And I think that as a section, we covered sports in such a unique way. And I think the first time a lot of people began talking about the intersection of race and sports and culture was in the Times. A lot of stuff we did, I know I was free to really bring that type of perspective to commentary. And I think one of the things I really gained a great appreciation of at the Times was just the level of editing. I was really I mean, like you said, I started my career there at the Week in Review, but I always had a deep respect for the level of editing there, whether it was Joe Vecchione, who was just a wonderful human being, but just was a great editor. Neil Amder, just a great editor, a very wise editor. Lawrie, Tom Jolly, great, great editor. I guess I just always had a respect to how, in fact, we were attached to the rest of the paper. It was just probably one of the most unique journalism experiences I've ever had, and I'm happy. I'm so happy to have gone through that and to have been there. I mean, I think that's when I'm thinking about everything that's happened, I focused on basically everything that we all accomplished together, not necessarily focusing on whatever is happening now is happening now. But I'm just happy that we all had an opportunity to build what I thought was just a very great and unique experience. Like I said, I'm still putting all this together. What does this mean with what you poured a lot of your heart into no longer exists? Do you focus on the memories and the things that exist, or do you think of what it means going forward? I don't know what it means going forward. I just know that what we all accomplished together, what George accomplished, what Claire accomplished, what Lawrie accomplished, and what we're still continuing to accomplish. I mean, our careers are still going on in large part because of what we did there. So we're still creating, we're still going on, and the Times is going to go on no matter what they do with the sports department. They'll figure it out. But I'm just happy that we were all able to be teammates there, and we created a lot of stuff that was special and great and very powerful. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Bill, I just want to say that the moment I heard the news about the New York Times sports desk was preceded by the point I heard about the LA Times cutting back on its sports coverage. It was just a day or so earlier. You might remember they said they're going to stop publishing the listings, the standings, all of that. And I said, oh, that's really sad. And then this came like a big bombshell to just completely yank the desk. But it also reminded me, Bill, of another institution you were part of, and that was Sports Reporters on ESPN. And that was my Sunday morning viewing every single Sunday. Loved watching you on there. And then, of course, when it was pulled for business, other reasons, I felt so bad. And I'm sure this has echoes for you as well.
Yeah, well, all things. I mean, I guess that's the thing too. And I wanted to ask each of you. I mean, I did the Sports Reporters for 27 years, and everything changes. Things that's sort of everything changes. Everything evolves, and if you're fortunate enough to have a long run, that's great. And I guess when I'm looking at this, now like I'm working at ESPN's vertical, Anscape. We were the undefeated, now we're Anscape, and I'm mentoring a whole part of what they established there, the Rodin Fellows. And each year, we just named our 7th class. We have 6 kids from 6 HBCUs, and they get a 1-year paid fellowship to provide content for the undefeated, for Anscape, for ESPN, and hopefully find their way into the business. But I guess I'm just wondering, Claire and Lawrie and George, when you think of something like this happen, when something disappears, I guess you're looking forward. So, well, what does this mean? I mean, sports is still, people still love sports. They're still crazy about sports. But in our business, I guess what all this means is, do we need to change how we cover it? Does this mean that we need to change the way this love of sports, which is not going away, does it change? What adjustment do we have to make in terms of how we reach people? Because it's not, it's not the same as when we entered the business. Things have evolved. And so I guess what I'm thinking about, okay, how do we evolve with it? What adjustments do we have to make? Claire, you teach, Lawrie, you're still involved, how do we have to make an adjustment to how we cover this passion for sports? I don't know. Maybe
Claire's teaching the next generation. I would love to hear what you think about that, Claire.
Well, the first thing I want to say about the next generation is that they don't have this ennui. All they see is, I want to work in journalism. This is the greatest choice I've made in my 18 years on this earth. They don't see this sadness or this fear or about journalism because they really feel that they're going to be the ones to turn it around, if you will, and not only survive, but thrive. And what I tell my students is we probably can't even imagine the vehicles with which you're going to reach the public. Newspapers, they could be the Etzel, or they could be vinyl and come back one day in super shape. But how they'll reach the public is the same as how we reach the public year after year, decade after decade, century after century, and that's through the ability to use the written word in a way that attracts readers and made our industry thrive. So every time I walk out of a classroom, I feel invigorated. I don't feel guilt about sending these youngsters into a dying industry. I feel invigorated because their energy and enthusiasm tells me that they might be able to do something our generations didn't, and that's figure it out. They're going to keep it alive. I am anxious to see what the vehicles look like. Twitter, it might be passe now, and Facebook and all, but there's something coming down the line that will allow the students and journalists everywhere to continue to write and report and be that fourth estate that this country and this world needs so badly. So if you want to get a lift, hop in your step. Bill knows this. Spend some time at a journalism school and they will lift you up.
And I will add, Claire, that, oh, sorry, George, were you going to?
No, go ahead.
That I supervise a journalism organization that covers education, but most of our reporters are young. And I would echo what Claire said. I have a lot of faith about the future because of them. I also think, Bill, in answer to your question about what adjustment are we going to be making as we go forward, the adjustment has been made for us, and that's the web. I mean, that's why the Times is using the Atlantic instead of very expensive unionized staff inside the paper, is that not everybody, but many people consume their sports news per sport. They follow only the sport they're interested in. They want in-depth reporting on that sport or that individual team from a specialist, and that's what they get with many of the new websites.
Yeah.
I'll make 2 points. To Claire's point about J schools, I had the pleasure twice in the last decade of going down to Austin, Texas to teach a couple of classes for our good friend, mutual colleague, Kathleen McElroy, who recently ran into a buzzsaw trying to go back to her university and teach journalism. And she ran into good Texas style governor, what's his name? And so she's back at Austin. I was in those classes and the students were so smart and so enthusiastic and so optimistic. I'd sit in a class and they'd be, the 3 football players taking a summer course knew all about the World Cup on assignment. They were giving it back to me about that, why the U.S. had the wrong team or they didn't pick the right players. It was really a pleasure to see. And I've actually helped one of her young people do a term paper on Texas Western and UK in 1966. And he wanted to know what it was like. Well, I covered that game in DC, and I was able to tell him about it. So that's the one thing, the curiosity of young people. Great point, Claire. The other thing is, let's not get involved in the false nostalgia for sports sections, because to me, the sports section was something with Dick Young covering the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1957 or 47 when I was a kid growing up. And it was, the paper would come out at 9 o'clock at night on the newsstands, and you'd see what the Dodgers did in day games. So that's the nostalgia for great sports section and energy, so full of it. But a great paper like the Times, do they really need that kind of traditional thing? The deadlines, the round the clock. The Times now has like a noon deadline for the Sunday paper. I'm on some of the lists still, and they have to put out a paper physical paper, but also electronic paper. And they just don't have time for game stories and what happened last night and getting it in the paper. And I can totally understand that, because looking at tonight, I know, Sri, you're going to get into this with today's paper some, but the idea of what they can produce, the great journalists who are working there, and sports may be, in fact, a dinosaur in that framework, but there's so much else in the Times this morning that they may be making the right trade even beyond how we feel about it.
That's a very interesting perspective, George. Thank you. Folks, if you're just joining us, these are amazing colleagues who work together at the New York Times over a long period. And the sports desk at the New York Times is going away. The way the New York Times is covering sports is going to change with the their purchase being built in a much stronger way. And we are just talking about the Times and all the great work the sports desk has done. There's been name checks of some great folks, including former students of mine, Juliet McClure and Ken Belson, and so many other people.
Right.
If you're just joining us, this will start at the top. As soon as we're done at 10 a.m., you will have on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Digimentor.group. You'll be able to watch all this. We've got some comments coming in. We're going to share them now. And if anyone would like to have their comments read on the air, please type it in the platform you're in now if you're live, and we will read that. I want to start by reading a note from our executive producer, Neil Parekh. His mom has sent in a comment saying, "My 8-year-old grandson reads sports section of the New York Times regularly with lots of interest, and now he's going to miss his favorite news from the NYT. The Times will tell you that you're getting, it's still the Times because it's the Athletic is part of the Times, but it is going to be different." As we heard a couple of you say, one of my favorite sayings is that I'm all for progress. It's change I cannot stand. And I remember when people were mad when there were ads on the front page of the New York Times, and people got used to it, or when it went to separate sections even much longer earlier than that. So many things change and we get used to it. Arlene Schulman, who's a great sports writer, is watching, and she says hi. And we are going to show you a note from Tom Jolly, the name that you've heard before. He's the print editor of the New York Times, and Neil and I have read the paper in his home, having bagels with the print editor of the New York Times, reading the New York Times out loud on social media. It's a #life highlight, as is this session. He says, "Being sports editor will remain the proudest period of my career, and the groundbreaking work Alan Schwartz did on concussions is the single thing that stands out. Also, damn, I got to work with legends like Dave Anderson and the folks who are on this show. Are you kidding me? I'm sure these folks will give great props to Neil Amdor, but I'll say that the section Neil created was what drew me to the Times sports section. The way sports was recognized as more than games being played, that was a reflection of our culture and often the first window into changes in society. Irish boxers raising the identity of their fellow Irish, blacks like Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali doing the same for their race, and the US women's soccer players doing it for women." Thank you, Tom. He's in New Zealand at the at the World Cup, where the US women are doing pretty well. And thank you, Tom, for all your support of this show and everything you've done at the Times. I want to see if Bill has a response to Tom.
Well, and Tom was great. It was just a joy working with Tom. But we were talking about journalism. So I teach this course at the Cronkite School, Arizona State. And the course is, for the past 4 years I've done it, it's commentary in the digital age. And I think that the point is that I think that insight is still very important, probably now more than ever. Why things are important, and to have well-reported, thought-out commentary that goes beyond Twitter and goes beyond, the snapshots. But to really, because I think people are still looking for meaning. What does this mean? How do things intersect? What is the connection between race and culture and sports? And I think that's one of the things that made our coverage in a time so important, that we were always looking for those intersections, those connections. It's not just a ball game. How is racism connected to everything else? How is sexism connected to everything else? And I think that that's what really distinguishes our section. And I think commentary is important. And I'm not sure what the next level is. I know that in this environment, maybe a lot of people, they've got subscribers. So they say, well, there's certain things we don't want to touch. We don't want to piss off, our subscribers. So we're going to keep a very narrow lane. And just thank God we were at a place times we didn't have a narrow lane. We had a wide world in a narrow bed, but we didn't have, a narrow lane. So anyway, when hearing Tom talk about that, about Jackie Robinson, Ali, women's soccer players, to be able to synthesize all of that into effective, thoughtful commentary, I think it was important. It's probably more important now because no matter, what the news is, George Vecsey always had a distinctive voice, a distinctive way of looking at something. Dave Anderson, distinctive way. Lipsight, a very distinctive way of looking at things. And I think that that's one of the things that's, that perspective is different. You can't buy that. You can't just make it like cookie cutter. So I'm not expressing this, but I think that hopefully, no matter where the section goes, I think you got to have distinctive, thoughtful, in-depth commentary because people are looking, well, what does this mean? Mm-hmm. How does it matter? Mm-hmm. So anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. I want to read this comment here from Colin Miner. The issue to me is that there's another step by the Times no longer being a local paper. The Times is a great paper, but should drop New York from their title. They're a great national paper, and while they have great metro papers, covering the city for its residents is almost an afterthought. And that's, of course, been something that a lot of people have pointed out about the Times and its local coverage in certain, not just the city, but around all the boroughs and the tri-state area. That has, of course, changed over time. I want to bring in a comment that came from Adnan Verk, who is an MLB analyst and a sports journalist himself and an anchor. And he sent me on Twitter a comment. The New York Times has been the paper of record for years, and its sports section has featured numerous talents who have inspired me. I hope those talents continue to sprout up in whatever iteration they may appear. And we also have a comment from, we found a tweet from John Branch, who has been a guest on the show. He has tweeted, he's saying, happening now, a celebration of NYT sports. Sri and Neil always do a thoughtful job of covering the NYT. Love seeing this incredible crew, including my friends and former colleagues, Bill and George. Thank you, John, for all your coverage in the paper, the stories, including, of course, the famous Avalanche story that you did that made such a difference in how people told online stories. Nothing to do with sports, but they learned from what you did in that Avalanche story. And that's part of why sports is so important, because not just all the things we've learned about society, but even coverage from the digital camera to the way that online storytelling is done. Sports has led the way in many, many cases. And so I think it's great that we will see John's reporting and coverage in other parts of the paper, and will continue to be an important voice. So John, thank you for your comment this morning. We've had, our show has been retweeted by all kinds of folks not connected to sports, including journalists, non-journalists, and others who are just talking about the end of the sports section. And what I'd like to do now is just get from each of you very quickly a thought about the Women's World Cup, or what you think about what's happening down there, the importance of women's soccer and sports. I'd like to hear that. And I'd also like to hear about some of the changes happening in baseball and what you think of that. Here is the cover of the Atlantic, not the Athletic, the Atlantic magazine. It says how baseball saved itself, about the speeding up of the game and how things have changed. So if we can do a quick round robin, and then we're going to look at the regular paper in the Times and then come back to our team. So I'm going to start with George, then Claire, then Bill, then Lawrie. So George, over to you. The Women's World Cup. as well as what's happening in baseball?
Quickly, the Women's World Cup makes me very happy to see. I've been interested in it since the early 90s when they were playing, and I couldn't get Neil and Rich Rosenbush to send me to a couple. Finally got to one in 99 because I think it was in the U.S. But the point was that the players are now gods to us. When I look back, Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy and all those wonderful players, Michelle Akins. But now I look at the players coming in, these young players that we saw last night coming in playing against Vietnam, I guess last night, the night before, how good they are, how young they are, how athletic. They've learned from watching their heroines, if you want. So I do see progress. The U.S. will and continue to play as long as they put money and energy into women's sports and pay and give facilities the way that Lawrie had to go at Yale. She had to go and shame them into getting a field and uniforms for their players. She's a hero at Yale for waving the flag for female sports at a great university. So there is that.
Thank you. Let's go to Claire.
Well, I think that the women are leading their fellow athletes across the board, all sports, looking not only at the quality of the game vis-a-vis what's shown on TV and all the bells and whistles that a network can bring, but also the quality of their lives, fighting for equal pay, joining one time very lonely Venus Williams pushing for equal pay in tennis. Now you have this legion of famous winning soccer players doing it not only for their sport, but for athletes everywhere. And that's that intersection that Bill mentioned of sports rights. You throw in other entities, social justice, financial wherewithal, and equality, diversity, equality, inclusion. And that's what this team represents to so many. So it's wonderful.
And of course, the coverage, there was a story yesterday in the Times about how the American women are making so much more money than their counterparts in from other countries, even very rich Western countries, because they fought for equal pay. And now the British, the Canadians are all fighting for that as well. Thought from you, Claire, about the baseball changes?
I don't understand where the difference lies in terms of the size of the bases. I think it's wonderful. I'm still trying to figure that one out, but it's just, it's hilarious watching so many games on MLB and how the commentators are trying to figure out the intricacies of the pitch clock and how it's a chess game now between the batters and all. But the thing that I noticed the most from the very start of this, as they shaved off unnecessarily dead time minutes, fans don't leave the ballparks now. They stay. Even in Dodger Stadium, they stay till the end of the game. And I'm sure there will be millions of dollars given out to professors to write theses on why that is. But I think it has to do with it's a more exciting game. The gift of the Negro Leagues to baseball after 1947, the running game, the speed game, the first to third, that's all back now. You even see people dropping bunts for base hits. That had all disappeared in the era of steroids, and now it's back. And being forced to just keep your mind on your pitching, stop walking around, consulting with your navel and things like that. They've tightened it up, and they've added, literally speeded it up on 2 different levels on the base paths and in terms of times of games. And wow, I think baseball and Rob Manfred and the gang should be given credit. They sure take it on the chin when the public perceives they did something wrong, but this has been a winner.
Thank you. I want to just go back to George for a second about baseball. We didn't hear your thoughts on the game.
I do agree with Claire. I can now count on a game. The hideous Mets, of course, they drive me away from the TV much sooner than the seventh or eighth inning, because I just know that ever since the Diaz went down, that they were going to have a bad year. But I do appreciate that there's more baseball that I used to see when I was watching back in the 40s and 50s when I was a kid. The one thing I would say about baseball is that the commissioner bringing gambling into the ads all over the place, people talking about it, I find that despicable. It encourages people to bet, which is dangerous. It encourages players to know it. And that's on Manfred when he has his first scandal, when the first baseball player strikes out 4 times because he promised his bookie that he would do that. And that's not far away. It's in other sports already. So Manfred went for the money, and he's going to have to live with it. That's his legacy, not the faster games.
I'll just say about that, it's still stunning to me, not just in baseball, but the Louisiana Superdome successor is called, is named after a gambling
Right.
site. That the
Right.
way gambling has infiltrated sports, when it was, at least they pretended there was a wall.
Right.
The fact that there are games and teams in Las Vegas, like it's hard to fathom
Right.
and understand. Let's go to Bill for her thoughts on baseball as well as the women's team.
Yeah, just briefly, I think George, you're right. I think that whole gambling thing is could be the beginning of the end of this enterprise. We're talking about sports. That moral erosion. I think that could be the beginning. When money becomes the highest value, I think that could be the beginning of the end. But just briefly, I love what the American women are doing in soccer. I love the fight. I love how they are taking the lead. I just think it's absolutely wonderful how they're fighting, and that fight is spreading throughout the sport. And I always thought, this is kind of going a little off field, that American women, the women's movement of this country, because I think that gender discrimination is more insidious, almost than even racism. Just racism is so predominant here. But I think that American women can have such a powerful impact on breaking that mold globally about the treatment of women. Whether we're talking about soccer, we're talking about culturally. So I really love the way the American women, the women in the United States, are fighting for equal pay. I think is wonderful. And I also think, I never thought I'd think this. I really think that soccer, we were talking about this off camera. Soccer and baseball are in this race to bring in a diverse population, but particularly the African American, the Black American athlete. I think baseball and soccer are both in this race to tap in to that young Black American. And for some reason, baseball had it, and then they sort of, we know the whole history of banning Black athletes. I think soccer really has a very, very, very high upside. Professional soccer is very young in this country. I think the MLS is 28 years old, 29, something like that. And I think in the next 30 years, because of what the women are doing, how they're winning, how they're bringing in better athletes, I think soccer really has a very, very high upside in this country. I'm very optimistic about it. I never thought I'd say that. But really, I think so. I'm looking at the crowds in soccer. It's lively. It's a lot going on. So in terms of baseball, I'm with you, Claire. I just don't know what the bigger bases mean. I mean, does that mean you have something more to grab on? And also, what is it about soccer? You also know what you're getting. The game is basically going to have 2 hours, right? I mean, none of this 3-hour kind of stuff. So baseball is just, it's kind of grandfathered in to our culture. It's not going away, but I do think that there's a great possibility that the sport of soccer could really, in the next 3 decades, could really, I know this seems blasphemous, could really catch baseball in terms of that interest here and tap into this global, because it's a global game, So anyway, once again, that's my story.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Roving
will say
soccer
that
guy. I'm not a soccer guy.
No, you are now.
you are now. I was going to say that I had said Tom Jolly is in New Zealand. He's not in New Zealand. He's watching the games coming from New Zealand. Andrew Das, who is assistant sports editor at the Times, is in New Zealand, and he's watching us right now. Lawrie, your thoughts on the World Cup, women's sports, women's soccer, and baseball, please.
I don't know how much time you have left, Sri, but I will correct Bill. MLS may be 28 years old, but professional soccer in this country goes back much further, and that's where the roots of soccer came from. Secondly, I would point out that the Times, because we are here to talk about the legacy of the Times, right? The Times has always had a distinction of covering the big events, Olympics, the World Cup, to the nth degree. They do a fantastic job of covering those events, and I'm sure we'll be doing so with the Women's World Cup. The Times now has very expert and intelligent soccer writers, including Andy Das. Hi, Andy. But the coverage of soccer as a sport overall and of women's soccer hasn't always been that wonderful. And I would point out to everyone, it's nothing to do with the Times, but there's another women's sport that has been leading the way in addressing racial issues and equality issues, motherhood and pregnancy issues, and that's the WNBA.
Right.
And I would also point out that soccer in this country exists in the form of a professional women's league, the WSL, that nobody attends or watches. So let's not get too excited about the Women's World Cup revolutionizing the sport in this country. It's really important. It will make a big difference. Bill is right. It's on the way up. But for women to truly achieve equal participation for the youngsters and then payment for the adult pro players, there's going to have to be a lot more support for the game at that ground grassroots level. And the women in the WSL have done a fantastic job. And the Washington Post, speaking of newspapers, led the way in covering this, in fighting sexual harassment by coaches of players. So all of those kinds of cultural issues that Bill references, that a good sports section will be having commentary on and will be covering, they're still out there. And if the Times isn't covering them, someone else, I hope, will be.
And of course, there's a lot of coverage and commentary in The Athletic. Let's see how they develop those voices over time. And we'll see. Donna Page has a comment. Wow, I remember some of the most important men in my life, granddads, dads, uncles, husband, and ex-boyfriends, scanning the New York Times front page, but ultimately it was the sports section they were there for. And of course, lots of women and women in readers read sports too, but in her life it was the men that were reading them. Chris Gorman, a great friend of Bill and mine, he's deputy director of the American Folk Art Museum, says the mixture of commentary and news is as essential to sports coverage as it is to politics, business, etc. One could argue that sports commentary may be even more important, lest people assume that sports are neutral, which they are not, and immune to the changes and challenges in our society. And here we're seeing the Times itself not immune to all the changes happening around it. Paula Kiger, someone on our DigiMentors team and longtime producer of the show, says, good morning from Tallahassee, appreciative of the New York Times sports coverage for so many decades. And Maury and Ina are watching from Hell's Kitchen, and they loved your comment, Claire, where you said they stopped consulting their navel, which is what baseball pitchers were doing. And Debbie says, yay, Lawrie, a feminist and sports leader always. We love hearing that. Speaking of former New York Times people, we have a tweet that's come in from Mike Tenier. I'm not even sure how to pronounce his name because I've only been reading his name all this time. Mike Tenier says, they must have lost my phone number, but this looks like a fun Irish wake, talking about this particular show. Folks, we didn't want this to be a downer. We want this to be looking at all the great work that's been done at the Times and in sports journalism in general. And there's a salute to sports journalism and sports journalists. And Apollo points out that the U.S. soccer team was started in 1913. You wouldn't know it, but it's an old Club. And when we come back, we're going to take a quick break, look at the rest of the paper. We're going to give our speakers a chance to just catch their breath. We'll be back in about 2-3 minutes. I want to ask them their favorite things they covered when they were at the Times, and look ahead, and also tell us about what they're working on now. Bill already mentioned The Undefeated and Claire, her teaching. We've got to, both Bill and Claire have things named after them. Lawrie and George, we got to work on that for you guys. We got to get things named after you as well. So we'll come back. Anybody watching who wants to give some money to donate something in George's name or Laurie's name, they can do that as well. So we're going to take a break. We'll bring you right back. Folks, thank you so much for watching. This is the New York Times Read Along. Every Sunday, 8:30 to 10 a.m. We read the paper out loud, and we talk about journalism. We talk about sports. We talk about all kinds of things that matter. And what we do is not just focus on the Times, but we do this around the country and around the world. We've done the Khaleej Times in Dubai, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Washington Post, the Chicago Daily Times, the Bergen Record, so the Newark Star Ledger. All of these are papers that we have done. There's a celebration of print journalism. So now I'm going to just take you through the paper very quickly and then come back to our team. I'm going to even stand up here and see what I can show you. The front page you saw a little bit of earlier, and DeSantis's flip on vaccine had steep costs for Florida. His campaign is built in part on the success of Florida during the pandemic, and this shows you that his state's health situation, death rate, became worse because of what he did. Oil industry, Venezuela's failing lifeline turns more lethal. On the front page, just by getting here, Morocco's team has won. This is the Women's World Cup. Drug industry fights to block talks on prices, and Spain's divide has far right poised to rise. Some in Belarus still live in fear for past dissent, and we know Belarus is in cahoots completely with Putin and what's happening there. The Sunday business cover is When the Circus Ran Off to Join Gen Z. Cirque du Soleil is looking to broaden its reach, perhaps with perfume that smells like a trapeze artist. Oh my goodness. Or a couch that embodies the spirit of clowning. That's the business cover. The Sunday Styles cover at the top, luxury requires obscurity. These days, the ultra-rich are reluctant to show their stripes, preferring to let their wealth whisper rather than scream. I guess this is a piece of art that you can buy. I'm not sure. And Hollywood's tireless secret weapon inside the studio of a costume master known for cheekiness, certitude, and an unerring style. Anne Roth, 91. Sunday Styles. The Sunday Opinion cover is How a Union Dies. It only took a year for Starbucks to smother one of the most energized labor movements in America. I did not know that part of the story. But of course, what's happening at the Times is also a union story, because the union jobs that were at the sports desk are now going to be moved elsewhere, and The Athletic is not unionized. The book review, Back in the Game, The Crook Manifesto. Colson Whitehead returns to Harlem, and his hero returns to a crime of life, by Walter Mosley's review of Colin Whitehead. And Colson is so prolific. I don't know how he does it. In terms of all the coverage, all the books that he writes. And here's the cover of the New York Times Magazine. They all have a 50-50 chance of inheriting it, a genetic mutation that makes them disappear into dementia in middle age. This is the story of what it's like to live with those odds. The Vanishing Family by Robert Kolker's story. I'm sorry we won't get a chance to do what we usually do, which is read these sections more in depth, but I did want to go into the sports section here, which is now inside the front page of the New York Times. If anyone knows exactly what the Times is planning to do, please share that in the comments. We'll read that out loud. But look at 3 full pages, 4.5 pages about the Women's World Cup. In a dazzling debut on the biggest stage, Smith finds a way. Not Claire Smith in this case, but Sophia Smith, 22. Scored point on every goal against Vietnam. U.S. team didn't finish well, but ended well. That's a great distinction. And here's a story about the Morocco's national women's team. By breaking boundaries, Morocco's team has won. I was raised feeling Moroccan. I always wanted to play for Morocco. She's from France. The player's name is El Chad. And in wins by 3 teams to watch, only one looks dominant. And this is about Japan, England, and Denmark. And finally, a coaching veteran tries to mend a fractured French squad. A few months before the Women's World Cup, Hervé Renard left a lucrative coaching gig in Saudi Arabia to take over French women's team with dissension. The only team spirit can make you realize your dreams. And there is a baseball story here. This year's class so shows the shift in how players are valued. McGriff versus Rowland, traditional statistics versus OPS and WAR. This is all inside baseball. And Rory Smith's column, soccer arrives in America again. And Lionel Messi, as we know, scored on his debut in Milan. So that's the paper. We're going to now come back to talk with our amazing panel. Let's remind you, it's Lawrie Mifflin, former sports writer and deputy sports editor of the New York Times. Claire Smith, first national baseball columnist of the New York Times. George Vecsey, former Sports of the Times columnist. And Bill Rhoden, former Sports of the Times columnist. We're so blessed and lucky and honored and privileged to have them all with us as we say goodbye to the New York Times sports section. I can't believe I'm saying that, but we are just delighted that they are with us this morning and able to talk to us today. So let's have them back and see if they did in fact join us again. They may have wandered off after that break. Thank you for coming back, everybody. As I was going through the paper, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just saying, I want to thank Lawrie in the great tradition of the New York Times editors issuing that correction. Yeah. You always hated to see that when you get a memo, hey, correction.
But can I interrupt you, Bill, because I have to correct myself now and say that the National Women's Soccer League, which is the pro league in this country, some of the teams attract very good. I just checked myself. The Portland Thorn had 16,000 people at their last game. Some of the other cities have, in the more 5,000 and 6,000 range. But the point is, women's soccer needs to be supported everywhere if people want to encourage it, and the same with the WNBA. Yeah. So I correct myself.
I love you, Lawrie.
I've had the honor of writing more than 40 stories for the Times, columns, reviews, etc. over time. And you're right, when the editor writes in to say there's a problem, you worry. But my favorite story is with Jack Lynch, who was a great editor on the business desk. I wrote for him and for Felicity Barringer. And I once said that I left out something in one of my columns, and I said, "This is the facts. Do you want to issue a correction?" And he said, "Don't worry, it's fish wrap now. So move on." Was his message of that thing. It was not an error. It was not a mistake. Not a correction. I could have added one more thing, and he said, "Don't worry about it." But that relationship between editors and reporters, writers, is so important, and we lose that as not just at the Times, but at so many places. That level of editing that's disappearing. That's a big problem for all of us as we look at this. But we want to talk to each of our guests to tell us about what are they working on now, and of course also their favorite story, moment, person, anything they like to leave us with about the Times. So I'm going to start with George.
Well, what am I doing now? I have my own little website, my little therapy website, I call it, called georgevesey.com. I cover some of these same things on there. What did I do in the past that the Times had me go? They sent me to Appalachia to cover for 2 years, where I got to meet Loretta Lynn, the coal miner's daughter. I covered all kinds of disasters, coal mine disasters. I see in the paper today, there's an article on West Virginia, wonderful piece in the editorial section on West Virginia, and they mention the Commodore with his boat, Joe Manchin, a classic public servant who calls himself from the extractionist state. So there's something talking about the real West Virginia, and that only the New York Times. So when people say I heard before, should it be called the New York Times? I would say it's a world paper. Everybody knows it. And as a New Yorker, a lifelong New Yorker, I say everybody knows it's the New York Times. Don't call it the Times. Although I notice the Manchester Guardian has been the Guardian. That's my go-to other site besides the Times. But it's the New York Times. And they got me I got to meet the Dalai Lama. I got to meet Casey Stengel, write about him when I was younger. I've had a great career, and thanks to the Times for that.
All right, let's go to Claire Smith.
Well, I think that one of the lessons learned early, thanks to Dave Anderson, we all watched as graphics became important, color became important, and nowadays all these newfangled ways of measuring sports that sports had survived without for so long, but now apparently can't survive without war and this and that and the other. So we were having a staff meeting one day on the phone, I think getting ready to cover a big event. I believe it was the Olympics, Lawrie. And about halfway through the meeting, after discussing the photos and the photo essays and the graphics and the numbers and this and that, Dave speaks up and says, "Are we ever going to talk about the writing?" And that stuck with me. I think the Times always emphasizes the writing. Every day you pick up the paper, it's like going to journalism school, but graduate school, and reading, especially on breaking news, just how well this newspaper functions as a leader in its field. So, and ode to Dave, shout out to Dave up there. It's always about the writing, Dave, and I hope and pray it always will be.
Lawrie, over to you.
What was the question, Neil? Is it our favorite moment?
Your final thoughts, kind of what do you want to leave our audience with as you reflect on everything that we've talked about?
And what we're working on.
And what you're working on.
Well, I have to agree with Claire. I'll tell you quickly what I'm working on. I'm the executive editor of the Hechinger Report, and there's a Times connection there too, because we are named after Fred Hechinger, who was a very distinguished education columnist for the Times for many years. I'll show you so that, I know you're going to put it in the chat, but that's how you spell it. And people who live, well, never mind. Anyway, we cover education. We are part of the new wave of nonprofit independent news sites all across the country. Some of them are local, covering local news and local areas, and some of them are topical, as we are covering education all across the country and putting our stories into general interest newspapers and websites around the country where they can have the most impact. So that's the little blurb for the Hechinger Report. Thank you, Neil, for putting the right address there, because people forget that it's .org, not .com. So yeah, and otherwise, as far as the Times' legacy, I wholeheartedly agree with Claire about the writing being the most important thing. And also with, I think, both George and Bill, that pioneering commentary and pioneering insights beyond just covering the results of the games and the ups and downs of the players. That's a legacy of the Times.
Absolutely. And Bill, over to you. We want to get your final thoughts and what you're working on currently.
I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. But Lawrie, just want to thank you. Claire, thank you so much. George, thank you so much. Love you guys. You guys have been such an important part of my life, and it's great seeing you again. And in terms of the here and now, I work for ESPN's Anscape. I write a weekly column called Locker Room Talk. I've been writing it since 2016. And I think probably the most important work, I teach a course at the Cronkite School, as I said before. But I think the most important work I've done, most enjoyable work, is working with these young students from the HBCUs, the Rodent Fellows, we call them. And it's just, I think, Claire, you mentioned it, just working with young people is just so inspiring, gratifying, and it gives you just a sense of hope that young people who still want to get into this business, whatever it looks like. So I'm still excited. In fact, I told one of them they got published for the first time, and I asked, well, how do you feel? So, well, it's pretty good. I said, listen, man, I still get excited about publishing, so don't take this stuff for granted. Anyway, so yeah, I'm still excited about our business, our industry, and thank you, Neil and Sri, about bringing this band together again. But love you all, and just really wonderful.
Absolutely. Sri, before we move on, I would like to add one thing I forgot while Claire was speaking. I want to give a shout out, and we've lost Claire for the moment, but I do want to give a shout out to the Claire Smith Center at Temple University and their website. You can find it at klein.temple.edu Sports Media Center. It's the Claire Smith Center for Sports Media, which we're very proud of and want to give them a lot of support. So thank you for that. And that's the website that where you can find it.
Excellent. I also wanted to read Diana's comment. My mother used info in the sports section to connect with my dad. She would memorize stats and learn about the players to grab my dad's attention. It worked. My dad would brag about my mother's knowledge all the time to other people, mostly his guy friends. Sports was my parents' love language. New York Times and Boston Globe sports sections were highly revered in my home growing up. She grew up in the Boston area. She's now in the West Coast, so she's watching very early in the morning. She's always with us, 5:30, 6 a.m. Pacific time. And so we're very grateful to her and everyone who makes this New York Times Read Along community. We do have shows coming up, lots of great guests coming up in the next few weeks. We want to tell you 8:30 a.m. Sundays, including soon we're going to have the author of this important book, The Girl in the Yellow Poncho, Crystal Brent Zook, is going to be with us, brilliantly capturing the complexities of contemporary Black women's experiences. The Girl in the Yellow Poncho is the most riveting, compelling memoir I have read. This is Beverly Guy-Sheftall talking about this book. She's a very well-known Spelman College professor of women's studies. So watch for this and many other great guests in the weeks ahead. We're going to go now to George Vecsey for his thoughts.
Just one thing I forgot to mention. We've referred a couple of times to the physical edition of the New York Times. It arrives in some of our doorsteps, and we buy it at the newsstand. The paper itself, the paper. And in my retirement, I've had more chance, for some reason or other, to get friendly with the people at the plant out in Queens, this beautiful building that I don't know if how many people know this. 30 different newspapers are printed in that building for all over, including some of our so-called competitors or colleagues are printed there. And I put a picture on my website recently, and I've gotten friendly with people like Nick and Deirdre and Mike Connors going in there. It's actually my clubhouse since I stopped being in the building, that I've actually gotten to see them more, and it makes my feeling of belonging to something. And they're my friends, and they're keeping the daily miracle going. That's what we call those little blue bags. Anyway, thank you.
And that's the picture from his website.
There you go.
I had the pleasure of getting a tour. Mike Connors gave me a tour just last month when I was in New York celebrating my birthday. He picked me up from my mom's house on a Monday evening and took me down for a tour from 9 to about midnight. And George, I looked at this same rack, and it was incredible. Not just putting out the Times, but putting out so many papers throughout the week, and getting to watch the process from the PDFs coming from the print shop, the print hub, into the plant, to making the print. And he actually gave me one the day that I was there. He printed out off a plate for me. And to watch it go all the way through the process, the printing, the ink, the paper, the big rolls of paper, and then the bundling and getting them on trucks. Just an incredible experience. I can't say enough about it. So thank you for bringing that up. And I want to bring Claire back in onto the screen as well.
And I want to say that we were able to do a live New York Times read along on a Wednesday night 2 years ago from the plant. We were reading the paper in the plant. It was another hashtag life highlight. And Mike Connors, as you've heard, is a great guy, and we are hoping to go back in there and read the paper with him inside the press. We have New York Times colleagues, because of the pandemic, hadn't made the tour yet, and they're so jealous that we got to do that. Sujana says, Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar says, Queens has so many hidden treasures, including the New York Times printing plant, which you can see when you're returning from LaGuardia into the city and other places. Jonathan Borstein says, this show is a definite home run, and thank you. And Walter Greason says, so thrilled to hear from everyone, but especially Mr. William Roden, one of the greatest treasures of modern journalism. Look at that, Bill. That's great. And Walter Greason's a great professor of history, and a colleague who has been on this show multiple times, and we're very grateful to Professor Greason. And Neil's mom says, great show, highly motivating. And I do want to, before moving on from George's wonderful comments, I want to tell him and remind him that he interviewed my wife many years ago. This would be, let me go back here. There's George Vecsey. In 2004, he interviewed my wife, who's a former athlete for India, one of the world's top women rifle shooters. And this was the quote. She talked about athletes and the disdain Indian educators, when she went through intense round of college interviews for college, they asked me, is shooting really a sport? And she said, I was gobsmacked. To them, it was not a sport, but a hobby. So George got the word gobsmacked into the New York Times, which is pretty cool too, as we think about everything that's going on here. Claire, while you were away, Neil pointed out the website for the Claire Smith Institute. Tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Yes, Temple University, my alma mater, decided in one of their strokes of genius, I say still incredulously, to ask me to come back as an assistant professor, but also asked permission to found a sports media center and in my name. So I am now the founding executive director of the Claire Smith Center for Sports Media, and that is evolving. Where it takes us, I can't wait to see, but it's all about opening up a better route for the underserved communities, if you will, emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion in one of the largest urban centered universities in the country. We're very proud of our diversity. We're very proud of our student body. We're especially proud of the Lou Klein College for Media and Communication. So that's what we're doing. I'm teaching and occasionally writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Excellent. Sujana says, go Temple. And Go Owls, go the Temple Owls. That's great. I will tell one of the great Temple alums and boosters, Kevin Nagandi, that we were talking about Temple from ESPN. Many of you know him. Let's read through a couple more comments as we wrap up here. John McDermott, watching from Italy. I always considered the New York Times sports section to be sports for smart people. And Diana says, an extraordinary guest panel today. Epic show. Thank you to all the guests and hosts. And this is what I call hashtag life highlight. That's really what this is. And Mary C. Curtis, great guest on this show and columnist and former New York Times colleague. Thank you all for the great conversation and a bit of nostalgia. So many other comments. Apollo says, congratulations, Miss Claire Smith. I'm in Temple's hometown of Philadelphia. Sudha says, Claire, there's a greatest honor for all the women too. And Patricia says, congratulations to all. So inspiring. And with that, we want to thank our friends at Muckrack for sponsoring the New York Times Read Along. We are taking next week off. By the way, if you'd like to sponsor our show, please let us know, or my newsletter, which is at Substack, sreenet.substack.com. We'd love to have you involved with us. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, let us know. We are always looking for great guests. You don't have to have anything to do with the New York Times to be with us, as we all know. And we want to also remind you that this show is brought to you by Digimentors, the company I co-founded. We do digital consulting. We make programs like this. We do a lot of training on social, digital, etc. And right now I'm doing a series of AI workshops. I call it my non-scary guide to AI. And we're offering that around the world. This is how I used to look when I started teaching folks in '98. I did have hair, and now I'm still at it. I used to teach classes on how to use Google and how to use email, because some folks preferred faxes. You might remember those days. But, we're going to wrap up here, folks. What an incredible morning. A great start to our week here. We're grateful to every one of you. Bill Roden, please follow him at Roden8. That's his new Twitter handle over the last few months. Lawrie Mifflin at the Hechinger Report, thank you so much. George Vecsey at George Vecsey, please follow him as well. And Claire Smith, what can I say? MZC Smith on Twitter. Neil Parekh, our amazing executive producer. The reason, folks, we do this show like this, I used to have a little thing that I did, and then he started watching and helping me. And the reason he felt connected to the show was because his father was a great local news, ethnic news publisher himself, the great Prakash Parekh. When he passed, he asked that the New York Times be included in the casket as he was cremated in the blue bag. Wow. The Sunday New York Times.
Sunday paper. We took it out of the blue bag. We took it out of the blue bag.
I'm getting worked up as I say that. And it was Neil's 50th birthday, and we got to celebrate Neil a few weeks ago in Westchester, where he's from. But thank you all, everyone, for being here. And go journalism is all I can say. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. And this is running as soon as you're off Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Digimentors.group. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.